Nominalizations must reflect the properties of deep structure. Deep structures, which often quite abstract, exist and play a central role in the grammatical processes that we use in producing and interpreting sentences. Such facts support the hypothesis that deep structures of the sort postulated in transformational or transformational generative grammar, or grammar in general, are real mental structures. These deep structures, along with the transformation rules that relate them to surface structure and the rules relating deep and surface structures to representations of sound and meaning, are the rules that have been mastered by the person who has learned a language. They constitute his knowledge of the language. They are put to use when he or she speaks and understands. And most mental functions of the brain, 95 to 99% of the functions and things happening with the brain, we are completely unaware of, and they do not manifest consciously. The examples that I have given so far illustrate the role of deep structure in determining meaning and show that even in very simple cases, the deep structure may be remote from the surface form. There is a great deal of evidence indicating that the phonetic form of a sentence is determined by its surface structure. From such evidence, it is fair to conclude that surface structure determines phonetic form, and that the grammatical relations represented in deep structure are those that determine meaning. And there are certain grammatical processes, such as the process of nominalization, that can be stated only in terms of abstract deep structures. The situation is complicated by the fact that the surface structure also plays a role in determining semantic interpretation. See deep structure and semantic interpretation in R. Jacobson and S. Kawamoto in Studies in General and Oriental Linguistics. Commemorative volume for Shiro Hattori, TEC Corporation for Language and Educational Research, Tokyo, 1970. I can say I have been taught physics by Einstein, but not Einstein has taught me physics. Rather, Einstein taught me physics. In general, active and passive are synonymous and have essentially the same deep structures. But in these cases, active and passive forms differ in the presuppositions they express. Put simply, the presupposition is that the person denoted by the surface subject is alive. In this respect, the surface structure contributes to the meaning of the sentence, and that it is relevant to determining what is presupposed in the use of a sentence. The role of surface structure in determining meaning is illustrated once again by the phenomenon of pronominalization. And again, I refer you to the Studies in General and Oriental Linguistics. To complicate matters still further, deep structure too plays a role in determining pronominal or pronomial reference. Pronomial reference depends on both deep and surface structure. A person who knows English has mastered a system of rules which make use of properties of deep and surface structure in determining pronomial reference. Again, he or she cannot discover these rules by introspection. In fact, these rules are still unknown, though some of their properties are clear. To summarize, the generative grammar of a language specifies an infinite set of structural descriptions, each of which contains a deep structure, a surface structure, a phonetic representation, a semantic representation, and other formal structures. The rules relating deep and surface structure, the so-called grammatical transformations, have been investigated in some detail and are fairly well understood. The rules that relate surface structure and phonetic representation are also reasonably well understood, though I do not want to imply that the matter is beyond dispute. It seems that both deep and surface structure enter into the determination of meaning. Deep structure provides the grammatical relations of predication, modification, that enter into the determination of meaning, etc. On the other hand, it appears that matters of focus and presupposition, topic and comment, the scope of logical elements, and pronomial reference are determined, in part at least, by surface structure. The rules that relate syntactic structures to representations of meaning are not at all well understood. In fact, the notion representation of meaning, or semantic representation, is itself highly controversial. It is not clear at all that it is possible to distinguish sharply between the contribution of grammar to the determination of meaning and the contribution of the so-called pragmatic considerations, questions of fact and belief, and context of utterance. And perhaps it is worth mentioning that rather similar questions can be raised about the notion of phonetic representation. Although the latter is one of the best established and least controversial notions of linguistic theory, we can nevertheless raise the question whether or not it is a legitimate abstraction, whether a deeper understanding of the use of language might not show that factors go beyond grammatical structure, and when they enter into the determination of perceptual representations and physical form in an inextricable fashion, and cannot be separated without distortion from the formal rules that interpret surface structure as phonetic form. So far, the study of language has progressed on the basis of a certain abstraction, namely, we abstract away from conditions of use of language and consider formal structures and the formal operations that relate them. Among these formal structures are those of syntax, namely deep and surface structures, and also the phonetic and semantic representations, which we take to be certain formal objects related to syntactic structures by certain well-defined operations. This process of abstraction is in no way illegitimate, but one must understand that it expresses a point of view, a hypothesis about the nature of mind that is not a priori obvious. It expresses the working hypothesis that we can proceed with the study of knowledge of language, what is often called linguistic competence, in abstraction from the problems of how language is used. The working hypothesis is justified by the success that is achieved when it is adopted. A great deal has been learned about the mechanisms of language, and I would say about the nature of mind on the basis of this hypothesis, but we must be aware that in part, at least, this approach to language is forced upon us by the fact that our concepts fail us when we try to study the use of language. We are reduced to platitudes, or to observations which, though perhaps quite interesting, do not lend themselves to systematic study by means of the intellectual tools presently available to us. On the other hand, we can bring to the study of formal structures and their relations a wealth of experience and understanding. It may be that at this point we are facing a problem of conflict between significance and feasibility, a conflict of the sort I mentioned earlier in the paper. I do not believe that this is the case, but it is possible. I feel fairly confident that the abstraction to the study of formal mechanisms of language is appropriate. My confidence arises from the fact that many quite elegant results have been achieved on the basis of this abstraction. And still, caution is in order. It may be that the next great advance in the study of language will require the forging of new intellectual tools that permit us to bring into consideration a variety of questions that have been cast into the waste bin of pragmatics, so that we could proceed to study questions that we know how to formulate in an intelligible fashion. And as noted, I think that the abstraction to linguistic competence is legitimate. To go further, I believe that the inability of modern psychology to come up to grips with the problems of human intelligence is in part at least a result of its unwillingness to undertake the study of abstract structures and mechanisms of mind. Notice that the approach to linguistic structure that I have been outlining has a highly traditional flavor. I think it is no distortion to say that this approach makes precise a point of view that was inherent in the very important work of the 17th and 18th century universal grammarians, and that was developed in various ways in rationalist and romantic philosophy of language of mind. The approach deviates in many ways from a more modern and, in my opinion, quite erroneous conception that knowledge of language can be accounted for as a system of habits, or in terms of a stimulus-response or SR connections, principles of analogy and generalization, and other notions that have been explored in 20th century linguistics and psychology, and that developed from traditional empiricist speculation. The final inadequacy of all such approaches results from their unwillingness to undertake the abstract study of linguistic competence. Had the physical sciences limited themselves by similar methodological structures or strictures, we would still be in the era of Babylonian astronomy. One traditional concept that has re-emerged in the current work is that of universal grammar, and I want to conclude by saying just a word about this topic. There are two kinds of evidence suggesting that deep-seated formal conditions are satisfied by the grammars of all languages. The first kind of evidence is provided by the study of a wide range of languages. In attempting to construct generative grammars for languages of widely varied kinds, investigators have repeatedly been led to rather similar assumptions as to the form and organization of such generative systems. But a more persuasive kind of evidence bearing on universal grammar is provided by the study of a single language. It may at first seem paradoxical that the intensive study of a single language should provide evidence regarding universal grammar, but a little thought about the matter shows that this is a very natural consequence. Consider the problem of determining the mental capacities that make language acquisition possible. If the study of grammar, of linguistic competence, involves an abstraction from language use, then the study of the mental capacities that make acquisition of grammar possible involves a further second-order abstraction. We may formulate the problem of determining the intrinsic characteristics of a device of unknown properties that accepts as input the kind of data available to the child learning his first language, and produces as output the generative grammar of that language. The output in this case is the internally represented grammar, mastery of which constitutes knowledge of the language. If we undertake to study the intrinsic structure of a language acquisition device without dogma or prejudice, we arrive at conclusions which, though of course only tentative, still seem to me both significant and reasonably well-founded. We must attribute to this device enough structure so that the grammar can be constructed within the empirically given constraints of time and available data. And we must meet the empirical condition that different speakers of the same language with somewhat different experience and training nevertheless acquire grammars that are remarkably similar, as we can determine from the ease with which they communicate and the correspondences among them in the interpretation of new sentences. It is immediately obvious that the data available to the child is quite limited. The number of seconds in his lifetime is trivially small as compared with the range of sentences that he can immediately understand and can produce in the appropriate manner. Having some knowledge of the characteristics of the acquired grammars and the limitations on the available data, we can formulate quite reasonable and fairly strong empirical hypotheses regarding the internal structure of the language acquisition device that constructs the postulated grammars from the given data. When we study this question in detail, we are led to attribute to the device a very rich system of constraints on the form of a possible grammar. Otherwise, it is impossible to explain how children come to construct grammars of the kind that seem empirically adequate under the given conditions of time and access to data. But if we assume, furthermore, that children are not genetically predisposed to learn one rather than another language, then the conclusions we reach regarding the language acquisition device are conclusions regarding universal grammar. These conclusions can be falsified by showing that they fail to account for the construction of grammars of other languages. And these conclusions are further verified if they serve to explain facts about other languages. This line of argument seems to me very reasonable in a general way, and when pursued in detail, it leads us to a strong empirical hypothesis concerning universal grammar, even from the study of a particular language. I have discussed an approach to the study of language that takes this study to be a branch of theoretical human psychology. Its goal is to exhibit and clarify the mental capacities that make it possible for a human to learn and use a language. And as far as we know, these capacities are unique to humankind and have no significant analog in any other organism or species. If the conclusions of this research are anywhere near correct, then humans must be endowed with a very rich and explicit set of mental attributes that determine a specific form of language on the basis of very slight and rather degenerate data. Furthermore, they make use of the mentally represented language in a highly creative way, constrained by its rules but free to express new thoughts that relate to past experience or present sensations, only in a remote and abstract fashion. If this is correct, there is no hope in the study of the control of human behavior by stimulus conditions, schedules of reinforcement, establishment of habit structures, patterns of behavior, and so forth. Of course, one can design a restricted environment in which such control and such patterns can be demonstrated, but there is no reason to suppose that any more is learned about the range of human potentialities by such methods than would be learned by observing humans in a prison or an army or in a schoolroom. The essential properties of the human mind will always escape such investigation, and if I can be pardoned a final non-professional comment, I am very happy with this outcome.